Dawn rose the way an old man stands, slowly, carefully, with a kind of quiet ache in its bones. The desert breathed out a long, tired sigh, one that stirred loose dust along the rancher's fence line and brushed the dry grass like a hand comforting a restless child. The world seemed still in those soft morning hours, as if even time itself hesitated before taking its first step. It was the kind of dawn that belonged to men who had lived too long with their thoughts. He stepped out of his cabin with the heaviness of someone who had grown used to silence. The porch groaned under his boots, sounding almost grateful for the company. His land stretched outward in all directions, wide and empty, rising into low hills where sagebrush clustered like survivors of an old war. This had once been a place full of laughter and footsteps and warm light spilling through windows. Now it was a place of distant memories, and one remaining horse waiting patiently in the corral. He approached the corral slowly, his hand sliding along the weathered wood rail. The horse lifted its head, eyes soft with the understanding only animals ever truly held. He whispered his morning greeting, letting the words fall naturally, without need for anyone to hear. The horse nudged him gently, the way it always did, as if reminding him he wasn't entirely alone. He slipped it a handful of dried oats, the last of what he could spare. Feed cost more than he cared to admit, and part of him wondered how long he'd be able to keep the horse at all. But letting go of the final living thing that shared his land felt like ripping out the last stitch that held his world together. Beyond the corral, the day warmed, slowly but certainly. Birds crossed the sky in quiet sweeps, their wings glinting with early sunlight. Coyotes watched from a distance, their movements almost respectful. Even the wind seemed gentle, as if unwilling to disturb the thoughts of a man who had carried grief for years. His wife and boy rested on the hill to the west, their graves covered in wildflowers he planted each spring. Some days he felt them close by. Most days he felt nothing but the ache of what time had taken. He busied himself with chores, though there were fewer each season. Mending a bit of fence, checking the well, sweeping dust off his porch that would return tomorrow. The rhythm helped him stay upright. The rhythm helped him forget that he was the last heartbeat in a place once loud with life. It was near sunset when he saw them, 3 figures at the far edge of his land. 3 young women moving with the weary grace of people who had walked farther than their bodies allowed. Their shadows stretched long across the sand, and though they came from Apache land, they carried no spears, no signs of threat, only exhaustion. He stood still, letting them approach at their pace, watching how carefully they moved, how their eyes scanned the horizon as though danger might rise from the earth itself. The eldest walked in front, her posture steady despite her fatigue. The middle sister carried a small pouch tied at her side, and the youngest walked barefoot, her moccasins slung over one shoulder, worn through by the long journey. When they reached the fence, they paused, as if unsure whether they were welcome. But they met his gaze with quiet bravery, a kind that came from necessity rather than pride. The eldest spoke first, her voice carrying the low, melodic strength of someone used to being responsible for others. She told him they came seeking a horse, that their father had sent them to barter for one, believing his daughters would be safer negotiating than warriors would. The rancher listened, the setting sun catching in their hair and casting golden outlines around their tired faces. They expected him to refuse. He saw it in the tightness of their shoulders, in the way the middle sister clutched her pouch as though she were ready to offer everything inside. Instead, he stepped toward the corral and unlatched the gate. The horse walked toward him willingly, trusting as always. He ran a hand down its neck, the gesture lingering with a softness that surprised even him. Then he turned to the sisters, offering the reins without a word. The shock on their faces was almost painful to witness, as if kindness was a thing they were no longer accustomed to receiving. The middle sister asked what they must give in return. Her voice trembled beneath the surface of her careful tone. The youngest shook her head slightly, as though she couldn't understand why a stranger would offer so much. The rancher simply said that the land had taken enough from their people, and from him too, and that sometimes a man had nothing left to offer the world but a small act of grace. His words drifted into the cooling air, settling over the sisters like a blanket they didn't expect. The eldest looked down, her breath catching as if she'd been holding it for years. She accepted the reins with hands that shook despite her calm expression. The horse nuzzled her shoulder, sensing her gentleness. The sisters bowed their heads in gratitude, each in their own quiet way. Then they turned and began the long journey back the way they had come, leading the horse with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. He watched them until they disappeared into the rising dusk shadows. Night came softly, wrapping the ranch in cool darkness. The stars emerged one by one, flickering like campfire embers scattered across the sky. The rancher sat on his porch, elbows resting on his knees, staring out at the dark shape of the hills. A strange feeling settled in his chest, part emptiness, part something warmer, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He had given away the last companion of his solitude, and yet, somehow, he didn't feel quite as alone. But as he leaned back and listened to the night sounds, the restless shift of distant animals, the whisper of wind brushing against the dry grass, an unease crept through him. The coyotes howled in a way they hadn't for weeks, their voices sharp and unsettled. Even the wind carried a different note, as if it were warning him that the desert was stirring with something unseen. He didn't know then that the world was already moving toward him, that the gift he had offered at sunset would return at dawn carrying the weight of 100 decisions he had never been part of. He simply sat in the darkness, unaware that far beyond the hills, hooves were gathering, warriors were preparing, and a father was riding with 300 men toward the ranch where a lone man had given away his last horse. Dawn crept in pale and hesitant, as if unsure whether it should disturb the fragile quiet that lay over the ranch. The rancher had slept lightly, waking several times to sounds he couldn't name, the way a man does when the world is shifting just beyond the reach of his senses. When he finally stepped outside, the air felt different, thicker somehow, like it was carrying a secret too heavy to hold much longer. He noticed movement first, far out where the desert met the early gold of the horizon. 3 silhouettes were returning, familiar in their shapes, their steady pace, the way they walked slightly leaning toward one another, as if the miles had bound them tightly. The 3 sisters, the ones he had given his last horse to, were walking back toward his home. But this time, something else rose behind them. Not the stillness of the land, not the gentle sway of morning wind. It was dust, an enormous, slow-moving cloud of it, rolling forward like a tide. He felt his breath tighten as he realized the sisters were not alone. They were leading a horse, not riding it. And behind them, invisible through the haze, but unmistakable in their number, came the rumble of riders. He stood still, the porch under him groaning softly, as if sharing the weight of what was coming. The sisters moved closer, their faces caught between fear and urgency. The eldest reached him first, her breath thin, her eyes troubled. She said their father had discovered the gift. Not just the horse itself, but the meaning of it. A horse was not a trinket. It was wealth, it was power, it was the beating heart of survival. To receive one freely from a white rancher was something that demanded explanation. And their father did not leave things unexplained. The middle sister added that their father feared the rancher's kindness might be a trap or a debt, or a sign of weakness meant to be exploited. The youngest confessed quietly that they did not know what would happen next. She said the truth felt too soft for a world as sharp as theirs. The rancher listened, his hands steady even as his mind circled around the realization that his small act of grace had awakened something far larger. The sound reached him then, faint but unmistakable. The distant, rhythmic thunder of hooves. The arrival of a nation. 300 Apache warriors riding as one. Their presence stirring the desert like a storm made of bone and breath and memory. As the dust parted, they came into view. Strong silhouettes atop horses, faces painted with tradition and warning, spears slung across backs, bows ready but not raised. They were not charging. They were approaching with the immense weight of purpose. At their center rode the chief, the father of the 3 sisters, his posture tall, his expression carved from stone that remembered old griefs and older wars. The sisters stepped aside, giving room for the chief to stop before the rancher. Silence fell around them, thick and tense. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still, watching, waiting. The rancher lifted his head and met the chief's gaze. Two men standing on opposite sides of history, yet sharing something deeper than borders or blood. The chief spoke with the authority of a man whose words shaped destinies. He asked why the rancher had given away his last horse. There was no accusation in his tone, only a heavy, measured confusion. The rancher answered with the same calm he had offered the sisters. He said he had nothing else to give, and that sometimes the world needed small moments of mercy more than it needed another man clinging to what little he had left. The chief's face didn't move, didn't soften, but something in his eyes flickered, a quiet flash of recognition, perhaps, or the understanding that grief recognized grief. Behind him, 300 warriors held their breath, waiting for his reaction. The rancher stood alone before them, yet he did not feel small. He felt honest, and honesty had a way of casting its own kind of armor. The sisters, unable to remain silent, stepped forward. They spoke softly but firmly, their voices weaving through the crowd like threads of light. The eldest told their father how the rancher had treated them, not with fear or superiority, but with humanity. The middle sister explained how he had refused their offer to trade, how he had given without expectation. The youngest spoke in the way of someone who had seen too much of the world too early, her words simple, but carrying a truth that cut deeper than polished speeches. She told her father that the rancher gave because he had known loss, and because giving was the only way he knew how to stay alive. The chief listened in silence. His daughter's words settled into him slowly, like ink soaking into parchment. He did not look away from the rancher, even as he absorbed every detail, every intention, every possibility. Trust was not a thing that lived easily in him. It had been burned, battered, stolen too many times. But he knew sincerity when he felt it, and the rancher's quiet, steady presence carried no weapon except the weight of his truth. With a slow motion that felt like a sunrise breaking through uncertainty, the chief dismounted. The warriors behind him straightened but did not move. He stepped closer to the rancher, his eyes never leaving his. He did not offer thanks. He did not offer suspicion. He simply stood there, acknowledging the strange, delicate bridge being formed between two men who should have been enemies, but were instead standing in a rare moment of fragile understanding. The fire they built that evening crackled softly, the flames catching the dry wood with little pops that sounded almost like the land exhaling tension. The rancher and the chief sat across from each other, neither needing to fill the silence. The sisters tended to the horse nearby, brushing its coat, speaking to it in their soft, melodic tongue. Warriors formed a wide circle around the perimeter, their figures somber in the fading light. The chief finally spoke, his voice deep but quieter than before. He asked again, not as a demand, but as a man searching for truth, why the horse? The rancher answered simply. He said the world had taken from both of them. Maybe giving was the only way to keep himself from turning bitter. Maybe he wanted to believe that kindness could still cross boundaries that guns and treaties never could. The firelight softened the chief's harsh expression, revealing lines that sorrow had carved long before this day. He admitted he was a man who could not afford to trust easily. Too many promises broken, too many families shattered. But he also said he listened when his daughters spoke, and they spoke of the rancher without fear. The rancher nodded, respecting the honesty. No romantic speeches, no grand gestures, just two men sharing the weight of their truths across a fire that seemed older than the land itself. As the night deepened, the ranch felt smaller under the vast sky, yet fuller than it had in years. 3 sisters sat nearby. 300 warriors guarded the perimeter. A chief and a rancher shared silence thick with understanding. The desert wind moved gently again, no longer warning but watching. Something had shifted between them all, something not easily named. It was not friendship, not yet. Not alliance, not forgiveness. It was the beginning of something that asked for patience and respect, something that could become powerful if tended carefully. And though none of them knew it yet, this quiet, fragile moment of connection would be tested before the sun dipped again behind the hills. Morning rose gently, as if trying not to disturb the uneasy peace settled between the ranch and the vast Apache encampment that had formed around it. The night had been long, filled with soft crackles of fire, low murmurs of warriors speaking in their ancient tongue, and the quiet breathing of horses who sensed the tension in the air. Yet when the sun finally pushed over the distant ridges, something calmer drifted with it, like the world was offering a truce, even if just for a day. The rancher woke before most of the warriors. He had slept lightly again, though not out of fear this time. Something about sharing the land with so many souls made the silence feel less empty. He stepped outside, expecting to be alone, but one of the sisters, the youngest, was already up, kneeling beside the water trough as she cupped her hands and splashed her face. She lifted her gaze and smiled softly, the kind of smile that didn't try to hide weariness but wasn't overcome by it either. He nodded in return, feeling something warm settle in his chest. As the morning stretched on, the camp stirred to life. Smoke drifted from small cooking fires. Children who had traveled with the tribe, though hidden behind the main lines the night before, peeked out curiously. The chief remained composed and observant, saying little, but watching everything as only a man who had carried responsibility for too many seasons could. The sisters drifted toward the ranch almost naturally. They did not crowd it, nor did they ask anything of a rancher, but there was a quiet pull that drew them near. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps gratitude, or perhaps, in their own way, they sensed the loneliness that lived in the cracks of the wooden porch and on the dusty floorboards inside the cabin. The youngest offered to help with the cattle. She moved with a quick, light step, speaking softly to the animals as though they understood every syllable. The rancher watched her work, struck by how gently she placed her hands on the creatures, how naturally they responded to her presence. He had forgotten how comforting it felt to share chores with someone, how different the morning sounded when footsteps other than his own crossed the yard. The middle sister lingered near the fence he had been mending the day before. She touched the splintered wood thoughtfully, running her fingers along the rough grain. She asked without words if she might help. He handed her a small hammer, and she took it with a steady nod. Her movements were sure and patient, the rhythm of her work falling into harmony with a soft wind drifting across the land. The eldest sat beside him on the porch, her posture composed, her silence almost meditative. She watched her sister's work, watched the camp in the distance, watched the rancher as if trying to understand the shape of his soul through the lines on his face. She did not pry, did not speak unnecessarily, yet her presence felt grounding, like the quiet of a river at dusk. Eventually, the middle sister asked gently how long he had lived here. Her voice carried respect, not pity. He hesitated, then told her the truth, that he had once shared this place with laughter and warmth and the sound of a child running barefoot across the boards. That fever had taken more than he knew how to bear. That for a long time after burying his family on the hill, he had lived as if each day were just a task to complete rather than a life to inhabit. The youngest paused at that, her eyes softening with recognition. Loss was a language the sisters knew well. The Apache had buried children too. Mothers, fathers, friends. They had lost homes, land, entire seasons of safety. They understood that grief was not a shadow that followed behind. It lived inside a person, settling into the corners of their heart like dust that never fully left. The chief, who had stood at a distance, walked closer then, drawn by the careful exchange forming between his daughters and the rancher. He approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt the fragile moment. The rancher looked at him with quiet respect. The chief lowered himself to sit on the porch beside him. Two men again, but this time not separated by suspicion. The air between them felt different than the night before. Easier, though still delicate. The chief spoke first, his voice deep and thoughtful. He spoke of raids that had taken members of his band, treaties that had been broken the moment ink dried, families who had been handed promises in exchange for their land only to watch those promises crumble into dust. He spoke of the constant burden of keeping his people alive in a world that changed faster than any of them could adapt. The rancher didn't interrupt. He didn't try to justify anything or explain away the wrongs inflicted by men who shared his skin but not his soul. He simply listened, deeply, with a stillness that let the chief speak without caution. This silence mattered. It was the silence of understanding, not avoidance. When the chief finished, the rancher spoke in a low voice. He admitted he could not imagine the weight of carrying a whole people's sorrows. He said he only knew what it felt like to lose the world inside his own home. He said grief was smaller on his side, perhaps, but not less real. The chief nodded. Pain, after all, did not compare itself. It simply lived. The sun rose higher, painting the land in warm hues. Warriors sharpened arrows, children laughed at the edge of the encampment, and a kind of unexpected harmony settled between the ranch and the Apache. The sisters continued helping through the afternoon. The middle one asked him questions about the land, how he cultivated it, where the water lines ran. The youngest tried to teach him a few Apache words for the cattle, which made her laugh softly when he mispronounced them. The eldest continued to watch with a calm that seemed to anchor everyone around her. Later, when the wind shifted, sharp and strange, the chief stiffened. His eyes scanned the horizon with instinct shaped by years of protecting his people. The rancher felt it too, though he could not name it yet. The sisters paused in their work, tension slipping into their breaths. Somewhere in the far distance, birds rose suddenly into the sky, as if startled by something unseen. The chief said a rival band had been moving unpredictably in recent weeks, drawn by the heavy presence of warriors and the scent of a gathering. Some groups saw unity as weakness. Some saw gifts across cultures as betrayal. Some lived only for conflict. The rancher didn't hesitate. He said he would stand with them if trouble came. Not out of obligation, but because something in him refused to see these people, these daughters, this chief, as strangers anymore. They had shared truth. They had shared work. They had shared the fragile beginnings of trust. The chief did not thank him, but he looked at the rancher with a quiet, profound acknowledgement. It was more meaningful than words. Whatever was coming, they would meet it together. Evening slid across the land like a slow-moving shadow, deepening every color until the world felt dipped in copper and memory. The sky glowed bruised purple, streaked with the last stubborn lines of sun that refused to surrender to the coming night. Fires flickered to life across the Apache encampment, small circles of warmth that kept the darkness respectful but curious. The rancher stood near one of them, feeling the heat on his palms, the breeze on his back, and a quiet storm turning somewhere far beyond the ridges. The sisters were close by, their movements slow with a kind of tiredness that came not from labor, but from waiting. Waiting for the quiet to break, waiting for the chief to speak, waiting for the world to reveal whether peace would hold or shatter. The eldest kept her gaze on the horizon. The middle one sharpened a small knife with smooth, rhythmic motions that were almost soothing. The youngest sat near the rancher, her eyes darting between her sisters and the gathering clouds of dust rising far off in the east. The chief approached then, his silhouette tall and resolute against the firelight. His expression held no panic, only the heavy certainty of a man who knew the language of danger far better than the language of rest. He told them softly, softly enough for only those close to hear, that scouts had returned with troubling news. A rival band was indeed approaching, drawn by the sight of so many warriors gathered in one place. They believed the chief had formed an alliance with the rancher, and alliances, in their eyes, meant threats. The rancher asked how many riders there were. The chief answered without hesitation, more than 60, riding hard, with weapons ready and pride sharper than their arrows. The chief turned his gaze toward him, and for the first time all day, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He did not want this man to bleed for Apache grievances. He did not want his daughters caught between sides. He did not want more souls buried in the desert where only ghosts kept watch. The rancher didn't step back from that truth. He didn't lower his gaze. He simply said, in a calm voice that felt like stones settling into the earth, that he would stand where they stood, that if trouble came to his land, he would not hide from it, that his blood was no more precious than any other man's, and perhaps that was what made it worth offering. The chief didn't thank him. He didn't have to. Night crept deeper, folding the camp into its vast, cool hands. Warriors tightened saddle straps, checked arrows, whispered guidance to their horses. The sisters prepared quietly, braiding their hair back, tying small pouches of herbs to their belts, moving with a kind of grace that belonged to women who had been taught since childhood that the world could shift beneath their feet without warning. The rancher stepped inside his cabin briefly, retrieving the rifle he had not used in years. His hands trembled for a moment, not from fear, but from memory. His boy had once begged to hold that rifle. His wife had once laughed at the stubborn pride he felt carrying it. He took a slow breath, letting the ache settle into something steady. When he stepped outside again, the youngest sister's eyes softened as she saw the sadness sitting beneath his resolve. The wind changed first. It swept low and fast, carrying with it the faint tremble of hooves. The chief lifted a hand. Every Apache warrior froze, listening. Even the horses stilled, ears pointed toward the east. The rancher heard it too, a growing thunder, the sound of force approaching without hesitation. Then the dust appeared, rising like a dark storm cloud, rolling with violent intent. The rival band crested the ridge. 60 riders, faces painted in harsh blacks and reds, weapons glinting under the moonlight. Their leader rode at the front, his posture proud, his anger immediate. He shouted accusations into the night, claims of betrayal, of weakness, of alliances made with those who had stolen land and driven tribes away. He accused the chief of forgetting his ancestors, of bending to the mercy of a white man. The chief remained calm, his voice steady as he answered across the wide silence between them. He said a gift did not mean surrender. He said kindness was not a blade. He said no one had bent, only listened. But the rival leader was not a man who listened. He charged first. The world broke open. Horses lunged forward. Arrows sliced the air. Warriors shouted war cries that shook the ground beneath their feet. The Apache encampment moved like a single organism, shifting, dodging, responding. The rancher took position near the porch, firing only when necessary, his aim careful, not driven by anger, but by the need to protect the people who had stood beside him at dawn. The sisters fought near him. The eldest stood as a shield, swift, calculating, guiding younger warriors away from danger. The middle sister moved like a river of motion, silent, precise, her knife hitting its mark only when absolutely needed. The youngest stayed near the rancher, her arrows flying true, her breath steady despite the chaos. The rival band pressed hard, expecting fear to break the ranch's defense. But they found not fear, only unity. A unity none of them understood. The rancher saw the rival leader charging straight for the chief, eyes burning with the need to prove dominance. The chief raised his spear, but it would not be enough. The rancher didn't think, he moved. He stepped between them at the moment the rival leader swung his blade downward. The rancher's rifle struck the blade aside, deflecting the blow. The chief, seizing the heartbeat of opportunity, knocked the rival leader from his horse. Silence rippled across the battlefield. Warriors froze, breaths caught midair. The rival leader lay on the ground, the chief's spear at his throat. The rancher stood behind them both, chest heaving, eyes sharp with the stubbornness of a man who had something inside him that refused to die. The rival warriors watched their fallen leader, watched the chief, watched the rancher standing beside him, not as an intruder, but as someone who had bled for their peace. Confusion replaced rage, then hesitation, then retreat. One by one, the rival band turned, riding back over the ridge, swallowed by the darkness that had given birth to them. A long, trembling quiet fell. The sisters dropped their weapons. Warriors exhaled deeply. Horses pawed the earth in relief. The chief turned to the rancher, placing a hand over his heart, an honor not given lightly. He said few words, but they landed with the weight of mountains. You stand with us. You bleed with us. You are not alone here. The rancher felt something shift inside him, something opening, something healing. The loneliness that had followed him like a shadow for years finally loosened its grip. As dawn approached, painting the battlefield with soft gold, the land felt changed. Not by victory, not by war, but by unity born from a single, simple act of kindness, a horse given freely. The youngest sister smiled at him. The middle one nodded respectfully. The eldest placed a hand on his arm, steady and warm, as if acknowledging something deeper than gratitude. The chief said his people would remember this night, that the ranch was no longer a lonely place, that peace, once fragile, had found roots, remembers you. And as the first rays of sun touched the graves on the hill, the rancher felt, for the first time in years, that the world had given him something back. This story carries the dust of the past and the heartbeat of those who chose courage over fear. If it stayed with you, if it sparked something inside your chest, like, share, comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more tales from Frontier Myths, where every whisper of the wind has a story, and every story